This is what happens when an airplane flies into a tornado. This is the story of Flight 431, the airliner that flew into a tornado. It's October 6, 1981, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, a place not used to tornadoes, with only 20 and 30 per year. However, on this day, the weather was unusually severe. A low-pressure system is working its way over the British Isles. With it comes a surface cold front and a faster-moving upper cold front. Just ahead of it is warm, moist air from southern Europe, which has set the perfect stage for supercells and tornadoes. In 1981, weather forecasting and storm monitoring is far less advanced than it is today. Doppler radar existed, but it's limited and lacks the ability to view storms in high fidelity. The reason? This part of the world is less prepared for tornadic activity, simply because of how rare tornadoes are here. On this day, the De Bilt weather radar site outside of Rotterdam would be scanning the skies, watching for developing thunderstorms. At the same time, 33 miles away at the Rotterdam airport, 13 passengers and 4 crew members arrive for their short hop south over to Eindhoven, with a final arrival into Hamburg, Germany. The aircraft is a 2-year-old F-28-4000, an extended version of the 1969 F-28-1000. The flight is being operated by NLM Cityhopper, a KLM airline subsidiary. The company has had an excellent safety record, carrying passengers on short-haul flights, but they've never faced anything like what they're about to encounter. The captain of this day's flight is 33-year-old Josef Werner, with 28-year-old Hendrik Skrull acting as first officer. Between them, they have over 6,000 hours of flying experience. The flight started out perfectly, and at 4:05 p.m., the aircraft and its 17 occupants lifted smoothly off the ground. Meanwhile, a few miles to the south, storms that fired 2 hours prior are intensifying. 3 of these storms are manually marked down from radar presentation and show signs of heavy rain and hail falling. This indicates the possibility of an intense updraft. And it's these powerful updrafts that are essential in the formation of tornadoes. This storm is starting to resemble a classic supercell that would be seen in North America, and in a matter of moments, swirling is seen on the ground, confirming the touchdown of a tornado. Just outside of the small town of Moerdijk, a local police patrol boat is operating on the Hollands Diep. Crew members on board the small boat spot a funnel, partially obscured by heavy rain, descending down towards the surface of the water. On board Flight 431, the radar identifies 2 storms. Unfortunately, this small radar located in the nose of the aircraft is rudimentary and only shows rough shapes of storms. The flight crew is totally unaware that buried within these storms is a developing tornado. They contact air traffic controllers on the ground to request a deviation around the severe weather. Aircraft, even large ones, cannot reliably fly into thunderstorms without the risk of damaging parts of the airframe. Opposing wind forces can be so strong within some of these storms that the aircraft control surfaces or even whole parts of the airliner could be torn away, and it's standard procedure to avoid these specific storms as much as possible. On board the police boat following the tornado, a crew member raises his camera to the sky and captures this photo. Fully planted on the ground, and an incredibly rare sight for the people witnessing this unfold. Another one of these witnesses is Bert Eastermans. He lives in Moerdijk and has a spectacular view of the approaching tornado, capturing this photo. At this point, the tornado is entering the industrial district of town. Thankfully, it's relatively weak at the surface. However, several thousand feet up in the updraft, the winds are spinning and shifting violently. Flight 431 enters the clouds attached to the supercell. On radar, the tornado-producing storm is being closely followed by a secondary cell. This creates a narrow pathway between the 2 storms. While no report mentions it, the crew could have been attempting to use this pathway to avoid the two cells. However, because of the storm structure, this places the violent updraft right next to the narrow path. Little did they know, they were on a collision course with the most powerful part of the storm. The aircraft starts to get buffeted by turbulence. At 7 minutes and 10 seconds after takeoff, the airplane comes in contact with the tornado. Violent winds start to impose huge G-load forces on the airframe, and 20 seconds later, the unthinkable happens.
Bank angle, bank angle.
Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!
The police boat crew follows the tornado and capture 2 more photos, one showing the funnel in its rope-out phase, and the second, an explosion from the ground. Witness to the tornado and subsequent crash, Bert Eastermans leaves his home, which is only a stone's throw away from the crash site. He arrives. Bert, along with the firefighters on scene, find a huge crater several feet deep, and the shattered remains of the jet. There was not a single object in the wreckage that was larger than a car. It's obvious to all at the site that there are no survivors of the crash. The scene is so disturbing, in fact, a firefighter suffers a heart attack at the scene and passes away shortly after.
De rest van het vliegtuig stortte tollend neer en boorde zich in het talud van een spoorlijn die rond het industrieterrein Moerdijk loopt. Daar deed zich opnieuw een ontploffing voor.
Just to the north, the tornado has since dissipated and left behind more damage in the town of Moerdijk. But thankfully, there are no reports of injuries in town. This storm would go down as the second deadliest tornado of the decade in Europe, with 18 fatalities. The Dutch Council for Aviation began to investigate the crash soon after. They determined that the aircraft came down in such a way and at such speed that the majority of the airframe was embedded in the crater, with other fragments being blown outwards in the direction of travel, littering the railroad tracks and southern road. However, one part stood out from the rest. On the shoreline north of Moerdijk, the right wing was discovered in a remarkable condition. This indicated to investigators that there was a mid-air breakup, resulting in loss of control and the eventual crash. A key piece of wreckage they look for is the flight data recorder, which records the flight parameters up until the crash. When discovered, it's sent to a laboratory for readout. Despite the loss of the right wing, it remained recording up until impact. It shows, at first, small altitude deviations associated with turbulence, then a large deviation of 1,000 feet, before a rapid descent and increase in airspeed, reaching over 350 knots, or 400 miles an hour. However, when the investigators comb over the vertical acceleration, or G-forces, the reason for the breakup starts to come together. The F-28 airframe was designed to handle G-loads between plus 3.75 and negative 1.5. The flight recorder readout displayed just over plus 6.5 and negative 3 Gs. These loads greatly exceeded the design capabilities of the aircraft, tearing its wing and forcing it into an uncontrollable spiral. Now the question was, what caused these loads? Was it a tornado? Investigators discovered something unusual in the altitude information, the spike of 1,000 feet in under 10 seconds. When they delved into this further, the conclusion was this was not the culprit of an altitude deviation. Rather, the pressure around the aircraft rapidly falling. It's important to mention that aircraft altimeters, the instruments used to display a plane's height above the ground, use static pressure measured by pitot tubes at the nose of the airframe. Thus, when the pressure goes down around the aircraft, the altitude is displayed as going up. In normal situations, the higher you go in the atmosphere, the lower the pressure. This meant the aircraft flew directly into the updraft of the tornado, where the low pressure resides. At the time, the tornado had lifted, but the rotating updraft still remained. The evidence was compiled, and a graph showing each of the data points was put together, showing how Flight 431 flew directly into the tornado and the rapid descent to the ground afterward. At the site today remains a plaque remembering the victims of the crash. This remains the only time in history an airplane crashed because of a tornado.